Church. Today we are looking at a passage from Matthew chapter 13 in our daily reading. Matthew chapter 13, at least the majority of it, is Jesus telling parable after parable after parable. These are all kingdom parables of Jesus explaining what life in the kingdom is going to look like. And we've talked about that in earlier devotionals, and you can go through and rewatch those if you want to. But today, the thing that stands out to me that I just really want to briefly focus on is why Jesus talks this way. Maybe you've never thought about that for yourself, why Jesus often chooses to speak in these stories that are kind of like riddles rather than just coming out and saying what it is that he's trying to communicate. In fact, the disciples ask him this very question. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 10, it says, "The disciples came to him and asked him, 'Why do you speak to people in parables?'" They also are wondering why Jesus chooses this method of communication to talk about the things of God's kingdom rather than to speak plainly, I guess. And the response that Jesus gives is quite interesting. This is what he says in verse 11. He says, "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven will be given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak in parables." He stops and he says that you've been had this revelation that's been made clear to you. A doorway has opened for you to sort of understand and get a sneak peek into what God is actually doing. And if you respond, he says, you'll be given more. But if you don't, well, that's going to be taken. Whatever you don't have, that's going to be taken away. And then he has this he has this quote or a series of quotes. He says, "For though seeing they do not see, though hearing they do not understand." And then he quotes from the prophet Isaiah, and he says, "You will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this people's hearts has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them." It's a really interesting thing that Jesus says. He quotes this passage from Isaiah that talks about the people's response to God's prophetic word. Right? Here's a word, here's a messenger who has come, and he's speaking God's truth, and the people will sort of hear, but they won't really understand it. They won't really listen. They'll see it, but they won't really perceive it. And it says that, in fact, the majority of people won't get it. Their eyes will be closed, their ears will be stopped up. But if that wasn't the case, if they actually saw and could hear and could understand, then they would turn and be forgiven. It's a really strange thing that Jesus says. In other words, he says, "I speak this way because I know people are not going to understand. I speak this way because I know people are not going to understand." Which is a very strange thing to do, right? Don't you want people to understand? Don't you want people to come and turn to God and receive forgiveness? Isn't that what you want, Jesus? But as you see play out through the ministry of Jesus, even when he does speak clearly, even when he demonstrates God's power and love in really amazing and powerful ways like healing or feeding 5,000 people or whatever it is, people still, they see it, but they don't really get it. They are interested in the miracle itself, but they're not curious about the miracle worker. And so Jesus says, look, I talk this way because I know people aren't going to get it. And people are just going to say, okay, that's a cool story, and then leave. Jesus is actually interested in those who come back to him, like the disciples in this case, and say, can you tell us what that was all about? I have questions about that. Jesus is interested most in those who show an interest in him. He's not interested in those who are following because of miracles or cool teaching or anything like that, but they're not really interested in Jesus. Jesus wants those who are thirsty for him and for the eternal life that he has to offer, and not just stuff. And so I guess the challenge for you and me today is, as we read through these stories, to think about, who is it that we are responding to? Do we read these stories and we long for more? We want to know what they mean, and we want to approach Jesus and ask him what these stories are all about so we can understand and respond? Or do we just read it and say, okay, tick that box, done? Jesus wants us to respond to him. So will you, as you read these stories, ask, seek, listen, hear, understand, and seek Jesus out?